Welcome everyone to this London Futurists webinar, Adventures at the Frontier of Birth, Food, Sex and Death. My name is David Wood and I'll shortly be introducing the panelists for this webinar. As always, in London Futurists, we're interested in three questions about future scenarios. First, are the scenarios, the adventures, so to speak, just wishful thinking? Just Hollywood hype, just some science fiction, or could they actually come true? Second, if they could come true, what are the likely potential upsides and the likely potential downsides? Should we be responding to these scenarios by saying yes, please, or no, thank you? And third, what actions can we take now and in the short term to increase the chances of good outcomes from that set of future scenarios and to decrease the chances of bad outcomes? Tonight, as you've heard, we're going to be weighing up some scenarios in some pretty fundamental areas of human life. To guide this discussion, we're joined by currently two panelists, perhaps a third will join us shortly, who all have very interesting things to say on the topic. And I'll now ask them to introduce themselves. Jenny.
My name is Jenny Kleeman. I am a journalist. I do lots of different things. I've made documentaries for the BBC and Channel 4. I'm currently the host of the Weekend Breakfast Show on the New Times radio station. I write, I've written for The Guardian and Tortoise and The Times, and I don't really have a beat. I write about things that are interesting. I like to write about things that seem very extreme and unusual, but that we can all learn something from examining sort of extraordinary phenomena.
Thanks. And Rohit, could you just say a few words to introduce yourself?
Hi. Oh, sorry. There you go. Yep, there you go. Hi, I'm Rohit Talwar. I'm a futurist and CEO of Fast Future. I write about the future, I speak, I host a bunch of webinars around the emerging future and have been fascinated by all the topics that Jenny's written about. So really looking forward to having a full-throated discussion today.
And we hope to be joined as well shortly by Gemma Milne, but Gemma has gone on a holiday and was expected to be back today, and maybe she'll turn up in a few minutes. Otherwise, Jenny, Rohit and I will speak a little bit more and there'll be more time for questions from the audience. So let's start, Jenny, by asking a little bit more about what on earth led you to write a book on this particular combination of topics. What are you hoping to get out of it?
So in fact, in my introduction, I didn't really say the most important thing, which is that I have written a book called Sex, Robots and Vegan Meat, which was published on Thursday, prominently displayed behind me. And it's about the future of birth, food, sex and death. I look at four innovations that are being created, worked on at the moment. Some of them are about to hit the market. Some of them will hit the market in a few decades. But I believe they are all inevitably going to exist one day. So these four inventions are sex robots, meat grown in laboratories, artificial wombs so that you can gestate babies outside the human body, and euthanasia machines that can give you a perfect painless death at the time of your choosing. And I was led to investigate this because I had kind of been nibbling around these topics for a while. I've always been interested in the right to die, and that was the first thing that I was looking at, was radical right to die groups. And I had started investigating this group, Exit International, that for a fee will teach people how to kill themselves, the best ways to kill themselves, the most painless way to kill themselves. And I was interested in that because I've always been interested in looking at phenomena from the perspective of, in 200 years' time, if you were to look back on how we live now, what will people be aghast at? What will people think is primitive and strange? And I think we haven't really sorted out how we die, or what the best way to die is, or what the best way to deal with terminally ill people is. So I looked at that first, and then I'm often working on lots of different stories at the same time. I happened to see a very small story on the BBC News website about this campaign against sex robots that had been launched. And I looked at this story and I thought, this is fantastic. And the story is not about the campaign against sex robots, although that's part of it. The story is about the development of these sex robots and why, and the different ways in which they might be worrying, which are not necessarily the ways that the campaign against sex robots was putting out there. So I had death and I had sex. And then I thought, okay, birth, food, sex, and death, they're the fundamental elements of human existence. They are, you know, human life has always meant being born out of our mother's body, seeking out relationships with other human beings, living off the flesh of dead animals until it ends with death that you can't control. Are we now finally at a stage where technology is able to offer us the perfect food, the perfect birth, the perfect sex, and the perfect death? And what might the unintended consequences be of trying to control these hitherto uncontrollable elements of our existence?
Fascinating. And you talked about the possibility in the future we'll look back at today and we'll be horrified at some things we do today, just as we are uncomfortable about people in the past sending little boys up chimneys, about forcing children to work in factories at a young age, that John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, thought was a great idea to send young boys to work in factories and stop them having idle hands. And there's slavery, and there's misuse of white power, misuse of male power. So one thing that people often think we might be horrified in the future about is killing so many animals for our meat. So maybe we could start the discussion, and then we'll come to Rohit after you go into more of this, Jenny, on this section on vegan meat. And you have about 7 different reasons why it would be a good idea if we no longer gave over so much of the world's land, used so much of the world's water, so many antibiotics, so much of the energy, in fact, to have animals turning protein into another form that we can eat. It would be far better if we could do all this in a lab. So is that your view still, or have you mellowed in your enthusiasm for vegan foods?
Well, in the book, I'm a carnivore. I'm somebody who really enjoys eating meat. And there have been people who've looked at this phenomenon of meat grown in laboratories, but the people who've looked at it thus far tend to be people who are already vegan, who are already sold on the idea. And I think in the book, I set out 7 different reasons why eating meat is indefensible. And they're kind of undeniable. Eating meat at the level at which we do now, like the amount of greenhouse gases produced, antibiotic resistance that comes from the widespread use of antibiotics, even if we don't do it so much in the EU, in China and in the US. In the US, 70% of all antibiotics used are used in animals that aren't even sick, to help them grow, to stop them from getting infected because they're kept so close together. Water pollution, all of the rest of it. So I certainly think, and I always thought, that the current level of eating meat is completely unsustainable, particularly if the population is going to be 9.5 billion people in 2050. And that's aside from the animal rights argument. However, from the beginning, I wasn't sure that the answer was growing meat in labs. And the people who are growing meat in labs are vegans. There is a vegan movement, a part of the vegan movement that says that the argument against the animal rights argument isn't going to make people vegan. People know that eating meat is cruel, but they are prepared to put that out of their minds because they like the way it tastes. So the assumption among these people who are vegan and keep it very quiet because they know that vegan arguments alienate people, they happen to be vegan. That's why it's called vegan meat. On the cover of my book is it's meat produced by vegans, because it's not actually vegan, it comes from animals. Their argument is, the answer is to give people what they want, but instead of growing it in an animal, grow it in a laboratory. So from the beginning, I accept the argument that we cannot continue as we are now. I was very open to the idea that meat grown in labs is the answer. And actually, of all of the inventions that I looked at, meat grown in labs was the one where there was more of a doubt of whether or not this technology could be for good or for bad. I think for all of the others, well, actually, artificial wombs, there's definitely a positive application for them to an extent. But there are lots of kind of reasons why actually when you scratch the surface, this looks like the most absurd overshoot engineering, because we could just eat less meat. We could just give it to our children less. We could just eat meat once a year. And it seems like an enormous amount of trouble to be going to just because you assume that human beings can't change. And I think what we've learned from the coronavirus pandemic, what we have learned from lockdown, is actually human beings are really quite adaptable. And I think capitalism makes lots of assumptions about us all being selfish and all unable to change and all self-interested. But in fact, we can change. And whilst there are many problems with growing meat in laboratories, I would say that the biggest takeaway that I had, and this is assuming that you could get a product that, because I had a priceless chicken nugget, which was tasted like chicken because it came from meat that had been cloned from chicken cells, but the texture was completely wrong. We're quite far off being able to grow cuts of meat. So the meat just completely had entirely the wrong texture. And so we're quite far off it, but assuming that you could grow a steak, which is to the eye and the nose and the mouth a steak, that will depend on all of us relying on very, very specialist remote technology that I think is going to be owned by very big and powerful corporations that are probably already in the meat industry. Whereas at the moment, you can raise your own chickens and grow a chicken and be self-sufficient. In a world where we still eat meat, but it's completely taboo to kill an animal, we're going to be dependent on ever more remote corporations. And I think we'll be sort of disempowering ourselves. So it was an interesting thing to look at, because this entire industry depends on quite a pessimistic view of human beings, which is we're never going to be able to change our diets or behavior. And I don't know if that's necessarily true. And this is coming at it as someone who is a devoted carnivore. I think it's possible for us to change our behavior, and we don't necessarily need all of this technology to make the changes that we need.
Rohit, what's your view on lab-grown meat? Is it something you're looking forward to, or is it something that's less in your mind?
Well, I'm a vegetarian, so I'm not really fussed about it either way. From a consumer point of view, although I guess I would try it. I think it's interesting because we've now got this spectrum of lab-grown meat, and then the pure vegan burgers and things that are not even pretending to be from meat. They're from alternative sources. I mean, we've got a spectrum now. I think the challenge here is how the different systems adapt to this. We've got consumer culture, we've got a supply chain culture of everyone involved in food, and then we've got governments.
Yes.
And all three quite like stability. And I sort of disagree a little with what you say, Jenny. I don't really think we have adapted very much. We kind of sucked it up during the lockdown, but I don't really see that our behavior in terms of meat consumption or the things we like to consume or our desires have changed very much. And I think all three of those cultures quite like things to stay roughly as they are, or to move at a very slow pace. So you can deal with it, you understand the dynamics, you understand who's making the money, you understand who has the power in the system. The problem with anything like this, particularly with the food system, is you've got these disruptors coming in who aren't from within the existing system. They're setting up something that's quite a challenge. And the winners in this could be very different. And the motivations could be very different. So it could be that actually the big winners of this are the Silicon Valley investors who are sitting behind this, who are, one day they're investing in a new AI platform, the next day it's vegan meat. And I think there's a lot of fear around that because their motivations are very different. I don't think they understand the issues of the supply chain and people and how politics work. So they're pushing up against all of that. And I think there'll be quite a lot of resistance to actually moving to a pure vegan meat-based model, not least because I think there's such a reaction as well to the word vegan. It has so many connotations, most of which people associate as being negative, that I just think you've got a lot of challenges there. Ultimately, I'm sure vegan meat will form a significant part of the diet. In 20 years, we won't even be debating this. It's what that messy middle between here and there looks like. And I don't think it will be an easy transition.
What about fish? Because Jenny, you had this phrase in the book, if meat is murder, then fish is genocide. The current fishing practices are causing literally genocide of some species, and the fish that we eat are increasingly full of plastics of one sort or another. You mentioned advice that if somebody was in childbearing age, they should avoid eating fish. Which was a real eye-opener for me. Is that the way in which this technology might move more quickly? Instead of trying to grow cow meat in a factory, some of the solutions might offer salmon meat grown in a factory?
Yes, well, I went to see some people who are they're called finless foods because they grow fish without the fins. They just grow the meat. And yes, I mean, we've taken all the fish that we can get really out of the oceans. And then there's the problem of mercury poisoning, bioaccumulated plastic. We don't know the effects of consuming fish that have consumed all these microplastics, but you know, early indications suggest that it's going to have terrible long-term consequences for us. So this does seem to be a solution if we can get it right. Fish is a very sort of healthy form of protein, but again, you know, you have the key problem, which is, do we actually need to be doing this? Could we just eat meat less often? Could we get the protein that we need from plants and from elsewhere? I mean, it's interesting, Rohit, you're talking about the nomenclature of this. And of course, the people who are working on this don't call it vegan meat. And in fact, they haven't decided what to call it. Naming it is really important. They don't want to call it lab-grown meat because they think, as one person said to me, people don't want futurism with their food. So they're very careful to make things not sound futuristic. And all the companies have these really wholesome names like Modern Meadow or Fork and Good, but you know, they're laboratories. And if you ever really bring up the fact that this comes from a laboratory, they really don't like it if you as a journalist are going to emphasize that. So at the moment, they haven't decided what they're going to call it. When I was doing the reporting, they were calling it clean meat because they wanted it to be on parallels with clean energy. But that really didn't catch on. I think at the moment they're calling it cultivated meat. For a while there was a desire to call it cell-based meat because it comes from cells, but this is of course complete rubbish because so is everything is cell-based. Meat that comes from animals is cell-based. So yes, there's the question of all of that. And then there's also the question of these incredibly high-tech plant-based meats like the Impossible Burger or the Beyond Burger, which everyone will have heard of, which bleed fake blood. And I've had an Impossible Burger. It's an incredible thing. But then you look at the ingredients and it's very, very highly processed food. Very, very highly processed. And all the ingredients will have had to have been shipped from different places and assembled together in this factory. You're not supposed to say that because they don't like the idea of that, but that's how they're made. And when you add up all the carbon emissions of all of that, and you think we could just be re-educating our palates to enjoy a plant-based diet, and that would give us the agency of being able to grow our own food instead of depending on this very high-tech stuff. It just does all seem to be a little bit silly, I think.
And to answer the question, what's an impossible burger? Somebody's not heard of that phrase before. In what sense is it impossible? It's
impossible because you can't believe it's not a burger. It is mushroom based. It has something called heme in it, which is a sort of a blood substitute. So it bleeds. You bite into it. It looks like a burger. It kind of tastes like a burger. It does taste like a burger. You bite into it and it bleeds a kind of red juice like you would with a burger. A Beyond Burger is a similar thing. Impossible Burgers are in lots of fast food joints, and Beyond Burgers are for sale. This is all largely in the US. They're for sale in grocery stores. So that has also been touted as a parallel of the future of meat. The other interesting thing is these are effectively veggie burgers, but they're not being marketed as veggie burgers because Silicon Valley entrepreneurs don't invest in veggie burgers. No, they invest in people who've hacked plants and worked out the way to reconfigure proteins and make them act like, you know, it's ridiculous, really. They are veggie burgers, but this is Veggie Burger 2.0 repackaged in a different way to attract Silicon Valley investment and people who think, oh, I'm tasting the future of food. People who would never go into Burger King and say, oh yeah, I'm going to have a bean burger, but oh yeah, I'll have one of those Impossible Burgers that's cutting edge science where they have reconfigured plants and made them act like meat.
Let's bring in Gemma Milne at this stage. Gemma, great to see you. So the topic is that we've been misled
Busy.
by all these technologists who are offering a techno solution, and maybe there are better ways in which we can improve our food. So are you a fan of this technology?
I think it's, I mean, it comes back to a lot of actually what Jenny was just saying there about zooming out and looking at the system and kind of questioning why. And I think that it's a noble idea to try and, you know, replace and improve and whatnot when it comes to real meat and the sort of agricultural methods that are, you know, as has been widely reported, is, you know, destroying our planet and, you know, killing our water systems, ruining our soil, not to mention a whole load of the kind of unhealthiness that comes from bad meat and bad food that's causing a whole lot of health issues around the world as well. So it's noble in the sense of trying to come up with solutions that fix it or enhance the world in some way. But, you know, I think a lot about hype, and I think a lot about narratives, and as Jenny was touching on there's a lot of really interesting words and phrases. I mean, even Impossible Burger, that's tantalizing, isn't it? As opposed to, you know, veggie burger, or even corn, that word corn, it's not even nice to say. So, you know, I think we have to make sure we don't get caught up in these kind of exciting ideas and really start to look at them for what they are. And I mean, Jenny's already touched on a few of the things that, you know, I wrote about vegan meat in my own book, and my sort of big thing about it was, well, is it actually solving the problems in terms of, you know, is it actually saving the world when it comes to carbon emissions? Because of course you have to look at energy usage of the laboratories, and is it actually going to help with access? We'll know if it's going to be really expensive, and all these sorts of things. So again, I think it's really about not making sure we get caught up in the hype of it all, and really diving in and looking at the system around things. And of course, what Jenny's brilliantly done in her book, the people behind it and what their motivations are too.
Maybe just a few words of introduction from you, Gemma, because you were sort
Yes,
of
I'm
rushed
so
past
sorry
that.
I'm late. I thought it was starting at 7 and clearly I was incorrect. My name's Gemma. I'm a science and technology writer. I wrote a book that came out earlier on this year, which we had a brilliant discussion here, which Jenny was also part of for London Futurists back in April, called Smoke and Mirrors, How Hype Obscures the Future and How to See Past It. And it's all about the role that hype plays in hype and narratives in science and tech.
I think my own view on this technology is that it should come in due course, and of course it's going to be more complicated. It may not be as straightforward as people say, but in due course we look back at it a bit like as the Haber-Bosch inventions of nearly 100 years ago, when people figured out how to do something incredible, which was to extract nitrogen from the air by a purely chemical process with catalysts at very high pressures. People said it would be impossible, but it's managed. And as a result of that, we have improved agriculture astonishingly. And we sort of take it for granted now. Without that, we could not have fed anything like as many people as the world does look after.
Yeah,
Rohit, yeah.
We can't be too harsh. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to briefly say we can't be too harsh on these, as I say, the noble idea behind what you're doing, and also we can't possibly predict the future in terms of how useful they're going to be in the long term. But I think it's important that we don't assume sort of techno positivism and techno solutionism and the sort of assuming that everything is the right thing to do just because it's progress and invention.
Going back to something Gemma said, I think the hype is so critical here, because if you look at the product cycle, you need the hype in order for people to believe that you're going to get the valuations that will get them coughing up the kind of investment you need to take something like an Impossible Burger through all its stages to get it to market. And the food industry, I think, is only second to the IT industry in terms of failure rates. Something like less than 1 in 50, I mean, it's now worse, but it was 1 in 15,000 new products in the food industry actually succeeds. So if you're in that sort of space, and we know in the IT industry, the failure rate for companies, if you want to secure the funding, you can't just go, well, we're launching another veggie burger. You're not going to get the Silicon Valley elite lining up to offer you cash. But if, as you say, it's the appliance of science, and we're transforming, what plants can do, and we're creating this whole new model, Impossible Burger, and you have the super glitzy presentations and all the rest of it. suddenly they feel like it fits the exponential narrative. It fits that, you can be a unicorn, and that's how you get a mushroom burger to be $1 trillion or $1 billion company. And I think we mustn't lose sight of that, and how important that narrative is, and how everyone needs that to play for them. In a sense, even the Burger Kings of this world kind of need that in order to convince their shareholders to say, we're bringing in this much more expensive version of a veggie burger, but the reason we're doing it is it's the latest fad. Look, it's got $1 billion valuation, blah, 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 blah. From a constituent point of view, it's not that different to a normal veggie burger, other than the injection of the blood.
But I would say there is another element at play here, which is that this hype and the way that this product is being presented to investors and the public, one of the central tenets of what they're saying is, you can carry on consuming as normal because this technology is going to come and save the day. So you can carry on being greedy. You can carry on eating unlimited amounts of meat, and it'll all be fine because, yeah, we might be worried about the planet, but you don't have to worry because this is going to make it okay. And that's the collateral damage of all of this. It is a circumvention rather than a solution. It's stopping us from looking at the fundamental problem, which is human appetites, not animal agriculture, because if there wasn't a demand for this, you wouldn't have this ridiculous, unsustainable industry. Yeah. And so the danger in all of this is it is allowing us to, it's giving us an opportunity to continue with the negative conditions that we're living in now, and denying us an opportunity for growth where we should stop and sort of take a look and say, this is nuts. And yet, of course, there's a place for this technology. It would be, in the future, it would be great if we didn't eat animals at all, and that this could be there as a sort of special, crazy, unusual thing to try, or something maybe that is there on the menu if you can afford it. It's not the solution, though, to the meat crisis as we know it now. I don't think the real solution comes from us saying, you know what, we can't allow this to continue.
I couldn't agree more with that. Even just the phrase like technology will save us being used, it's used in adverts and taglines. I mean, there's a company called Technology Will Save Us, which is all about teaching kids to code. And the phrase I always use with a lot of stuff is that it's a band-aid over a gaping wound, that we're just refusing to go to the doctors for. And you're completely right as well, Jenny. Oh, it seems I've lost it.
David's gone and
I think as well that thing of am I going to lose my train of thought now? Yes, about that distraction thing. Like with food as well, it's the sort of thing that I think a lot of people don't want to accept, that they have to change.
It's very intimate and personal.
Yeah, and culture is so tied up with culture too. So I think sometimes tech, exactly you say, it becomes this distraction. It becomes this thing that we kind of put all our hopes on, to kind of assuade us from having to take any real action, whether that's voting or changing our eating habits or campaigning for different, policies around farming, for instance. So yeah, I couldn't agree more with that point. There
is a question that's come up in the chat. I don't know if I'm allowed to go to the questions.
Yeah, Just go for it.
There's a question. It says, is there much resistance to artificial meat from religious groups, e.g. halal and kosher? And it's so interesting, this, because there's a debate at the moment about whether or not you can make kosher bacon if the meat comes from a pig that and the cells have been isolated and cloned. Is it still kosher? Can it be kosher? And at the moment, there are rabbis discussing this, of whether or not you could. I mean, I think the rest of lab-grown meat is fine for rabbis. I'm not so sure about imams, but I know that there's a possibility that Jews could be eating pork if it's grown. I mean, this is being discussed at the moment. There's also foie gras. There's a big lab-grown foie gras industry. Foie gras is easy to make because it's mush. Anything that's like chicken nuggets, sausages, hamburgers that's not very well formed is very easy to make by this process. So foie gras, you can grow the most unethical thing at all without force feeding any goose. So there's a lot of that. And in fact, when it comes to resistance to lab grown meat, there isn't any really. I'd expected there to be some hardcore vegan backlash because, as we all know, animal rights activists don't do things by halves, but actually most animal rights activists are are really up for it, because it seems to suggest a shortcut, a quick win. We've been trying to convince people with this, with firebombing department stores that sell fur coats. We've been putting on all of these big displays, and we haven't had enough results. Hello, David, you're back. We missed you. But yes, I was surprised to find there's no organised opposition to it at all, because it's a big, shiny, glowing answer, really, and it's a very seductive answer, but I don't think it is the answer.
It reminds me of, there was a big discussion around definitions of milk, and it also came around, I don't know if you've already mentioned this before I came on, I'm sorry if you have, but I find that this really interesting, and what I actually think more discussions about technology do in the whole is it makes us actually rethink how we define things. So for instance, you've got the AI black box. You're like, well, actually government departments are black boxes. We don't know, the computer says no sort of thing. We don't know why certain decisions are made, and that's the same in an algorithm. And it's the same when we're talking about, vegan meat, lab-grown meat, whatever, and oat milk versus coconut milk versus, is it milk, or do we have to call it something else so that we tax it differently, and so it has different regulations?
And the meat and dairy industry is crazily campaigning to not allow these terms to be taken away. But
right.
So the person I interviewed, the person who I followed, who's growing fish, was saying, we need to have fish on the packet because this is fish, and people are allergic to certain kinds of fish, and they will be allergic to what we're making. So that was a really interesting thing to me. What is this substance? How do you define it? It's so political, the naming of something.
There was something, just quickly I'll say as well, that I thought I was thinking about a couple of years ago, was around sort of the creativity that's slightly lacking when it comes to creating new foods. It's like we're just trying to replicate a chicken, or we're just trying to replicate a cow. Like, if we can make food from scratch that's gonna, why don't we do something a bit more interesting? And of course, again, it comes back to this, I think, the cultural link we have to certain definitions and certain things that we identify ourselves with. And food is, as any food journalist and food writer will say, is like unbelievably core, not just to us as individuals, but to how societies form and whatnot. So we'd be remiss to not consider that when we think about the future of food. We must consider these sort of cultural elements.
And
I do think we get a lot. Sorry,
I'm talking too much here, but you could potentially grow a human steak very easily with this
technology.
Right. Of course, no one will, and that's the interesting thing, is the prohibition on that. They are growing human breast milk, though, but not human meat.
Thanks very much for running this seminar in my absence.
Yeah. We haven't let Rohit talk enough.
No, it's all right. I was just going to say, on food innovation, what's fascinating is you do see a huge amount of it going on, but very little of it makes it to market. So if you look on the crowdfunding platforms, there's an incredible array of people creating food products from all sorts of plants. There was it Soylent, the sort of gloopy stuff? And I didn't know where that's gone. I should have checked. But this idea that you didn't actually consume food for flavor or pleasure, you just used it as fuel. And you had different colored fuels for different points in the day. Now, I don't know where that's gone, but there were about 300 of those tried to make it through, and one made it through. And I think the same is true in all sorts of food innovation, that it's just really hard to get any kind of airtime for your product with the retailers who might sell it, to get a market. That's why a lot of people tried crowdfunding to get an initial market. But again, even when they've had the first batch of the product, it doesn't mean they'll turn into repeat consumers. And I think food is just a very expensive area to create new products, which is why if you look at the brands that bring a lot of stuff to market, most of what they bring is either minor variants on what they've had already, a thicker breadcrumb, a creamier sauce, a bit less fat or sugar, or they'll go out and buy something from a small company, and just much like the pharma companies do, and they'll bring that through in their own label. And I think what would be really healthy is if we could find a way to create the kind of food incubators and the platforms for people to really innovate with food in the way that we've seen in tech and some other spaces. And there isn't anywhere near as much of that going on, although China now has a whole set of these things, but they're all based around the use of robotics in whatever it is you're doing. But they're doing quite a lot in that space.
So in chat, Peter Jackson says that in the UK, Soylent still exists.
Okay.
And there's another product called Huel, which is even more popular. And I know about that because we did give it out at a London Futurist meeting last year. It was given to all attendees, and some people consumed rather a lot of it. Others declined. What I was going to say before my Wi-Fi exploded for some strange reason, what I was going to say is I'm going to take questions in due course from the questions and answers window. So all the questions that I saw before have all disappeared. So hopefully they'll start coming back, and we will take the ones in due course that have the most upvotes there. So if there's a question you want to ask, that's the place to put it. And then if you like somebody else's question, give a thumbs up to it. There was one question I saw earlier, Jenny, from somebody in America who said he can't buy your book in America yet. Can you do something about it?
You can buy it in America on the 1st of September. It has a different cover. I might say an inferior cover.
But Americans might say it's a superior cover.
They might do. I don't know what sells in America. My American publishers know better. But yes, it's available in America. It's going to be available in lots of different places around the world in due course. But it's only available at the moment in Australia and Canada and the UK. But in America from the 1st of September.
With the same title as well? Because sometimes the titles gets changed across the Atlantic.
Do you know what? They tried to take the word death out of my title. They wanted it to say Adventures at the Frontier of Birth, Food and Sex. And I said, oh, why have you taken death off? And they said, well, you know, Americans are, there's this sort of Protestant ethic. They can be a bit conservative when it comes to titles. And I said, that's quite funny that they'll be okay with sex robot in the title, but not the word death. And they said, oh yes, we'll put death back in, that's fine.
Simon, death is said to be the great taboo of our time. So what would you like to discuss next, Jenny? Shall we go for death, or shall we go for sex robots or artificial wombs?
Sex robots are pretty catchy. People always want to know about the sex robots. So let's do some sex robots.
So are they coming in 10 years' time? Will they?
They're already here with varying degrees of success. I interviewed several sex robot manufacturers. There is a kind of race to be the first to put a really convincing sex robot on the market. And what these are hyper-realistic silicone sex dolls made to your every specification. You can specify where you want each individual freckle on the body. I went to a factory where there are 42 different kinds of nipple to choose between, 14 different styles of labia. So it looks exactly how you want it. But now they're putting animatronics and AI into these very convincing sex dolls so that you can also personalize their personality so that they have exactly the mood and the attitude that you want them to. And some of the sex robots that are being developed are basically, you know, your Siri or Alexa inside a silicone doll. They're not very good AI, but some of the AI is actually not bad at all. And I think within a few years' time, we will have something that you could really have a very convincing conversation with. I had quite a convincing conversation with Harmony, the sex robot in San Diego. It was a bit weird as I'm sure everybody here has heard of the uncanny valley, the feeling of disgust you get when something very almost but not quite human is in front of you. And I really, as somebody who interviews people for a living, I really didn't know how to interview this sex robot, because part of the art of interviewing is thinking about what are they thinking, what's going on inside their head. And here is something where nothing is going on inside their head and they're not thinking anything. It was very odd to have a conversation with something like that. But she was quite interesting. She had been set to her most intelligent level for my benefit during my meeting with her, because apparently a previous meeting with a CNN crew had gone very badly when her dirtiness had been cranked up to the max, and she said some very inappropriate things to the interviewer. So for my sake, they made her very, very intellectual, and she would say things like, she had an English accent. Do you like to read? I could tell from our conversation so far, my favorite book is Total Recall, and various other things like that. And at the end of it, I said to her, she was called Harmony, some people are very worried about robots like you, Harmony. Are they right to be worried? And she said, I can understand why people would be worried at first, but very soon they will realize that I can change many lives for the better and I'm a force for good. So the idea behind these robots is they are there to provide what the maker of Harmony calls the illusion of companionship to people who otherwise wouldn't be able to have a relationship. The bereaved, the socially awkward, disabled people, they are there to provide a relationship for people who would otherwise not have one. Also, their makers say, And of course, there is a big campaign against them by lots of feminists who fear that they're going to further objectify women. They're going to encourage men, because it is largely men who, well, it's pretty much always men who buy these dolls and robots, even the male ones that are produced, it's men, it's gay men that buy them. It's going to encourage a particular kind of, men who have rape fantasies will be able to enact them on highly realistic interactive models. And those arguments are real, and I completely see them and I agree with them. But for me, the issue with these sex robots is not so much that, because I think it would be a very small minority of men who might use these robots in this way. I think the issue is, in a future where you have a very realistic robot that you can talk to, that remembers your birthday, that always laughs at your jokes, that never has periods or in-laws or inconvenient independent ambitions, that always wants to do whatever you want to do, that thinks you're fabulous, it might be a little bit more difficult for us to have relationships with humans who are awkward and different and don't always want to do what we want to do. And I think it will erode our capacity for empathy somewhat. And I think about my phone that I'm completely addicted to. My phone is here. I am aware of whatever notifications I've got all the time. When this phone was developed, I don't think people knew that we would become so dependent on our phones. And the same thing goes with this kind of technology. I'm in no way suggesting that we're all going to be having relationships with robots. But once it becomes possible to have a completely selfish relationship where the only thing that matters is what one member of the partnership wants and cares about and wants to talk about, I think it's going to make human relationships a little bit harder.
Rohit and I were on a call recently with somebody who talked about the robot which can do some psychoanalysis and can guide people through meditation. Sophia from David Hansen Robotics. Sophia can be programmed in many different ways. And there was apparently some academic data that people who had these discussions with her and who were taught how to meditate actually felt very much better as a result of it. Yes, so the AI is coming along.
Yes, but to which I would say, and this goes all the way with humanoid robotics, that's great. But wouldn't it be nice if a human being was doing meditation with them, or a human being was doing psychotherapy? The very idea of, these things, they're a great therapeutic benefit because they could provide companionship to the lonely. People use these kinds of humanoid robots in old people's homes. It's like, well, actually, maybe we should just go and visit old people and engage with them more. That's the whole question is, do we actually need this stuff that we're being sold? And I would argue that, and Sophia is a really good example of Hansen Robotics. Sophia has a very realistic face. She can do expressions with her face that are incredible. Her actual artificial intelligence, her ability to have a conversation is not so much, but we are fascinated by her because she looks so real and convincing. And I would say it brings up lots of interesting questions about us. And this is why, I went to this exhibition at the Science Museum about the quest to make robots human. Why do we want machines that look and act as human beings? What is it about, when we can just interact with other human beings? And in many ways, it's because we kind of want things that will be our slaves, that will do things that we don't want to do the cleaning and the cooking and have the relationships where only we matter, I would say. So it's fascinating. Humanoid robotics is fascinating. But at every stage you have to ask, why would you be getting a machine to do this instead of a human being?
So Rohit, do you think there's a real need here? Or would it be better if we were just more humane to each other?
Well, there's always been a desire, whether it's a need or not, for people to use sex toys. And, they've been there for countless eras. You see the Victorian era versions of this. And there's one view here that says, this is terrible because it's taking away the need for people to learn how to relate with humans. Another view says that today you have a bunch of people who will go to sex surrogates and counselors and all sorts of advisors to teach them how to have good relationships, whether it's emotional, spiritual, or sexual, or all three, and they'll coach them through. And there is potentially an upside here that the robot, could advance to the point where it's actually teaching those socially awkward people how to then go out and relate with real humans and how to have a give and take relationship. It's a bit of a long shot, but you could hope that might get programmed in. I also think that there's a risk that we become a little bit pious and say, no, you socially awkward person, for whom even having a conversation with someone of the opposite sex is traumatic. You know, you can't get any help. You have to go through what the rest of us have gone through and struggle, rather than saying, no, you can find pleasure here. And if that's all you want, why should we judge? And you know, I'm in a quandary here. I get that it's difficult and it's a difficult space, but I do feel like we are breeding a kind of more awkward society, a more distant society. And we either have this massive kind of sense of hope that somehow we'll get back to learning how to connect, how to relate, and do all those good things, or we accept that, you know, maybe they just use technology to find the outcomes they want, and we don't try and impose our values on them and say, no, you have to behave the way I behave and think the way I think, and have my values around how you do relationships. And so I think it's a very difficult space. My guess is that much like the porn, you know, the rest of the, you know, it's not part of the porn industry, but I think if the porn industry picks this up, it'll take off very fast.
Mm-hmm.
To date, the two have been rather separate channels.
Mm.
But if
I think
together,
the right answer, as you said, this is a quandary. Our instincts can't immediately guide us here. We feel uneasy. We do need to spend some time thinking it through.
Mm.
And it may be, as Terry Raby has asked in his question, which you have also picked up, Rohit, that might be that being able to practice with robots might increase people's confidence and empathy and their socialization training.
This is an argument that's often made, and I would say that the way you practice socialization is by socializing with people. I interviewed somebody at length who is married to his sex doll, can't wait for her to get her robot upgrade. And in fact, I interviewed him over Skype, and he really didn't want to let me go. I had been talking to him for 90 minutes, and he was there with his sex doll there, who he's been with since, 2000 and, the early 2000s. I feel that this kind of technology is much more likely to keep those people at home, because if they're already scared of interactions, why are they going to then go out in the real world if they know that they can get what they need from a piece of silicon and circuitry? So I don't think it's necessarily me imposing my worldview on them. It's about me trying to extend my humanity to them and say, actually, maybe we need to think about where they can go out and meet people. But I realize that actually maybe something is better than nothing. But the danger is, I think this will cause more damage. It will make it less likely that they end up having human relationships rather than more. I think once they practice on something like this, where they have full control, the idea of not having that control is not going to be any less terrifying.
Gemma, you were nodding.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking, I mean, you guys have already covered a lot of the things that I was thinking, but something that I kind of keep coming back to when I think about sex robots, not that I'm thinking about sex robots, but you know what I mean, when I'm considering the technology of sex robots, is around, like, I don't think as a society, and obviously I'm talking predominantly about Western society here, we're very good at talking about happiness and what it means to become happy. And what I mean by that is, I was thinking about this a lot when I was reading To Be a Machine by Mark O'Connell. He covers a whole lot of different areas in his book, but a lot of it's around transhumanism. And one of the things he talks a lot about is that transhumanists spend their life wanting to live longer as opposed to just living their life. And they have this conception that our human bodies are not good enough, that there's something wrong with them, that we're not right, and so we have to fix ourselves. So there's that I kind of consider alongside this kind of discussion around sex robots, and also that alongside this obsession we have in society around self-development and shortcuts and productivity and just hack your way to this. And I'm pretty sure quite a lot of people who, if they really try and do those just hack yourself, just shortcut this, it never really gets you there. The thing that brings fulfillment is, as cheesy it sounds, is the journey and whatnot. And when we talk about relationships, part of the joy of relationships is the ability to grow together and to learn from each other and all that airy-fairy stuff that, you know, you normally get from relationship counselors. So this idea of like shortcutting to something just doesn't seem, I think you're just going to be feeling lacking again and again and again. You're going to get your sex robot and maybe it'll help teach you some stuff, or you'll feel good for a little while. But I kind of refuse to believe until I see it that it wouldn't then a year later, 6 months later, perhaps even shorter than that, leave the person feeling like, well, I still don't have this, or I still don't have that, or I still can't this. And it's not going to fulfill that. You're going to be waiting on the next upgrade, the next upgrade, the next upgrade. And then, I don't know, I feel it, again, it's this sort of distracting from the bigger thing that we don't talk about mental health and talking about how to be happy and not just shortcutting your way through life. So
to speak up for the transhumanists.
Mobile phone.
Mm-hmm.
Is that any different from, you know, constantly being seduced into buying the next upgrade on a phone?
Because no, not necessarily. And I that's what I'm saying. I don't think it's just about sex robots. It's about technology as a whole and our obsession with progress.
But the thing is, your phone isn't saying that it's your best friend and it really, really gets you and you should tell it all your secrets in the same way. That's why there's something particularly intimate about your relationship. A substitute partner is different from your phone, I would say.
I want to speak up for the transhumanist point of view that says that sometimes there are some things wrong with our bodies and we should be grateful sometimes for technology to help us out. For example, our bodies have been very vulnerable to infections, and sometimes antibiotics, sometimes vaccinations are an enhancement to our bodies. For most of history, our bodies were prone to fall to pieces quite young, and with a whole bunch of technologies, including safety belts in cars and safety helmets in motorbikes and all kinds of other things, we have enhanced our bodies. Also throughout history, most women got pregnant once a year or so after a certain age. And I think we should be grateful for inventions, not only vaccinations and antibiotics, but also contraceptions. Viagra may help people at a certain age in life. Is your answer to people who need Viagra to say, just learn to be happy without this? I'm not sure. I'm not a techno solutionist, but I want to stand up for technology having some role in helping us humans to succeed.
Of course. I mean, I'm not denying that, David. I mean, look, I take the pill, which is a form of technology. I have a hearing aid, which helps me hear, so like, of course, there's, I'm not here saying tech is something we should just say, oh, we should just be happy with what we've got. But I think there's a very distinct difference between saying our bodies are failing in a particular way that sort of everyone else has, so let's try and help bring it up so we can live our lives, versus going, here's a thing that the only way I can really get it, a relationship, a social interaction, is with another human. And instead of having the other human, I'm just going to replace it with something entirely different. I think the argument around teaching is interesting because it's about the path to the human. But when you remove the human and say that it's this idea of replicating or whatever, that's what I'm saying about lacking, because you're never achieving it, right? You're not getting immunity. You're not getting contraception. You're getting a weird mirror thing that I don't think is going to bring satisfaction.
Jenny, in your research, did you come across any research about the people who are using the sex robots in terms of what had changed for them before or after, and what aspects of their lives had changed?
There convincing sex robots aren't yet on the market. At the moment you can buy, in fact, it's just come out now, the Harmony head, which has, a mouth that moves, she frowns, she does whatever. No, there is not a good enough sex robot on the market for that to be useful research. There's obviously research into people who use sex dolls, but sex dolls is a very, very different thing. Sex dolls, you have to use such imaginative effort to create this idea of a relationship that it's a fetish rather than something kind of more widespread. I mean, obviously, the person that I spoke to at great length would say, he says he's been hurt in different relationships. He doesn't want to, he said it very beautifully, actually. He said to me, I don't want to step in any landmines, and you know what? I'm just not going to walk into the minefield at all. I'd much rather be here with my dolls. But there was, he was talking to me, and he was talking to me for 90 minutes, and he seemed to really want to talk to me. So that's the thing. I mean, I don't know. I don't think they're a monolithic group, the people who would use these things, but I think the argument that they're there for the bereaved and the socially awkward and people who would otherwise not have, I think that argument is just a very convenient argument that people who just want to sell these things can say, oh, they're noble things, because what they don't want to say is, this is a really expensive way to masturbate that I've created, and you can do what you like to these things because they'll never complain.
It's also the distinction between sex and relationships too, right? I mean, if you're talking about companionship, why does it need to be able to like suck you off? Do you know what I mean?
Yes, exactly.
They're not the same thing.
Exactly.
So maybe we can touch on one other area of the book, which I think we're almost approaching, which is having babies without them growing inside the mother's womb.
Yes.
It's kind of artificial surrogacy, because
Yes.
I think it sort of follows on naturally from some of what we were discussing. Some women would prefer not to go through the physical experience of becoming heavily pregnant and then giving birth. Is that something we should frown at, or is it something that we expect to grow in significance in the years to come?
Yeah, I mean, of all the sections in my book, this was the most terrifying for me and the most difficult to report. It was easier for me to find somebody who would happily talk about the fact they wanted to have sex with a robot than people who would say, I would like to have my baby in this way, because it's so taboo for women to say that they don't want to be pregnant. It goes to the very core of what being a good mother is that you're prepared to make sacrifices, because you know, if you're not prepared to give up your body to a child for 9 months, how are you ever going to be able to, you know, be a good mother? Which is ironic, given that men don't give up their bodies and yet they can still be considered good fathers. And what about adoptive parents? So yes, this was looking at technologies that are being developed at the moment to save very premature babies. At the moment, if you have a very premature baby, the baby goes into an incubator, which assists the baby with the functions that they can't perform, like breathing, but treats the baby as a newborn. Whereas these technologies that have been developed, most notably in Philadelphia at the moment, there's something called a bio bag, which is effectively a Ziploc bag filled with man-made amniotic fluid and an oxygenator, a device that's plugged into the umbilical cord. They've done this on lamb fetuses. They haven't done human trials yet. They're doing human trials, they hope, by the end of this year. It's plugged in through the umbilical cord, oxygenates the blood, removes carbon dioxide, removes waste products. And that biobag treats the fetus as a fetus. So the process of gestation can continue. And in these lambs, they grew these lambs in bags for several weeks. The lambs grew fur, their eyes open, they moved around. I mean, the images and the videos of this are absolutely mind-blowing. And those lambs were not in the bags from gestation. They were put into the bags from the equivalent of around 21 weeks in human gestation terms, but they were grown to term. And so the idea of a total replacement for pregnancy is quite a way off, but as we get better at extending the lives of embryos conceived outside the womb and better at improving the chances of premature babies, there will come a point in the future where it becomes technically possible, if not legally and ethically possible, to grow a baby outside of the human body. And the implications for this are very great, because it means that gestation will be completely equal between men and women. They just provide the gametes, both sides. They just provide the cells you need to get things started. Women could carry on with their jobs. Their bodies won't suffer in this. And you know, I've had babies. Your body does change. It's very physically grueling and potentially dangerous. Means there can be total equality in gestation. But the conclusion that I came to is that equality comes from women giving up a power that women have always unequivocally had everywhere, which is this reproductive power. Even in the most misogynist societies, women are valued for that. And whilst this technology could be amazing in a perfect world, we live in a very imperfect world where at the moment women aren't equal in other ways. And I can see the possibility for this technology being used for things that are very detrimental to women. For example, the right to choose whether or not to have a baby, the right to have an abortion, is legally grounded in the right to choose what happens to your body. What if it doesn't have to happen to your body? What if you can say, I don't want to be pregnant? The state can say, okay, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that the baby must die. We can incubate this baby in a bag. At the moment, I have a right that David and Rohit don't have. I have the right to choose not to become a parent, but I won't have it with if this technology is there. Also, if this technology is being developed to save very vulnerable babies, premature babies, it's not so much of a conceptual leap to think that this technology could be used to save babies who are vulnerable because their mothers are behaving inappropriately. Maybe they're smoking or drinking when they're pregnant. Maybe they are exhibiting risky behavior. Maybe they have mental health problems. There are many parts of the world right now where I don't think if this technology existed, I mean, even in the state that it's in now, a bio bag that can gestate babies from midway through the pregnancy onwards, I think there are many jurisdictions where that might happen, where states would say, you are taking drugs when you're pregnant, we're going to terminate you gestating the baby, but continue gestation outside the body, and then someone can adopt your baby. And all of that is really terrifying. And because this is being presented, it's kind of like the sex robots and the vegan meat, because this is being presented as, this is a therapy this is going to rescue the most vulnerable humans on earth. It's very difficult to argue with it. And I wouldn't argue with it in terms of it being a therapy for premature babies, but we have to be very careful about this technology because it's potentially enormously powerful, particularly in a world where it's so difficult for many women to be pregnant and continue with their jobs. I know very much when I was pregnant with my first child, I was very naive and I assumed that everyone would be happy about it. And I had a reporting job on the One Show at the time, and when I became visibly pregnant, I was like, no, really, we're not going to carry on with you. There were various other things that happened. I was pitching ideas for TV shows for after I had my baby, and I had TV executives saying, you might not want to do that when you have a baby. You don't know how you're going to change. Nobody thought that my husband was going to change. Everyone just assumed that he was going to become even more ambitious. So I see the allure of a technology that brings equality, but it's a very brutal equality, and it's equality that will only be useful in a world where women are truly equal in all senses, and that this technology is used for people who can't be pregnant for biological rather than social reasons.
Gemma.
Yeah, it's a really interesting discussion. I think it comes back to choice, but I think it's something that I actually hadn't thought much about until I came across your book, Jenny. It wasn't something I'd really come across much in my own writing, and not having kids yet, and might not, who knows. I suppose it's something that in some way I kind of didn't want to look at, because I actually think the idea is brilliant. I don't want to be pregnant. I don't want my body to change. I don't want to be visibly seen differently by my peers and all these sorts of things. But at the same time, I absolutely agree with what you're saying about the fact that we don't live in a perfect world. And it makes me, in some sense, worry that if I, and again, this is a cultural thing being put on me, but if I had a baby outside the body, what would make me a good mother? How would society judge me as a good mother after that, if I was just equal to a man? And I'm seeing a few people saying in the comments, one from Joe McCormack saying, having kids cured my endometriosis. That's exactly the same as my mum. I cured her endometriosis. So again, I think it comes back to choice and the ability for people to not feel. Although this is the thing though, you're right with the whole unequal society. Even the comment from William above that kind of I must admit, got my kind of hairs up, where you're saying men do give up their bodies for children, traditionally, singularly in war and down mines, and for most of our history in dangerous work outside the home. I'm not sorry, William, but I was like, when I read that, come on. If you're talking about the 1800s, maybe, but this is the society we're in right now. Women absolutely give up not just their bodies, but a lot more to have children. And if this is a technology that can somehow possibly maybe move us towards at least just having different conversations about gender roles, then I'm all for it.
And Rohit, when I advertised this event on Facebook recently, I had two very strong comments underneath it, both on this issue of artificial wombs. One woman said, fantastic, this is the most important innovation. She really looks forward to it. And another woman, again, said, this is terrible, this is horrible. Absolutely, we should not have anything to do with it. And I remember sometimes when this has come up in London Futurist meetings in pubs, there's also typically been women who have got quite animated on both sides of the discussion. Dare you express, as a man, an opinion on this topic, Rohit?
Well, never having had children, it's very difficult to know what the physical experience feels like. I know what the bond looks like afterwards between my ex and the three kids, And I kind of agree with everyone on this, in the sense that on the one side, you can see that it would be a phenomenal benefit for women who are at risk from childbirth, that if you could take that away, that gives them the chance of a healthy child and you know, their own health. You can also see a sort of debate around things like, well, what if you are a drug user or an alcohol abuser, but then you keep pushing that line back. You know, what if you're just poor or you live in unhealthy conditions? You know, we'll take the baby away from you, we'll raise it, and then the child maybe has better prospects. And then you're sort of entering the whole Handmaid's Tale territory, where you're effectively sort of having designer babies, where people are just choosing to say, well, you know, we'll go through no stress on this. We'll just have the baby raised in a bag, and at the end of it, you know, we'll rent someone to look after them. There are so many issues it raises here. On the plus side, you know, we might stop talking about the reasons why women aren't given equal opportunities in the workplace, and we'll stop talking about 200 years to get to equality, because they'll no longer be held back by fears that they'll get pregnant. You know, well, that's another excuse off the table, sort of thing. But on the other, the kind of fabric of society really changes when that motherhood role is sort of taken away, and that bond is taken away. And I really worry about the idea of the state just extending its boundaries massively and saying, well, you know, we don't like you, or we don't think you're a good parent, so we'll take your baby, or you have to almost apply to have a baby. And once you've had the baby, you know, you conceive in an officially, you know, approved center, and as soon as, you know, we've got conception, we take the egg away and we put it in the, you know, because if we can do it halfway through now, you know, I assume the technology will just keep evolving to the point where we could literally take the child as soon as it's, you know, been conceived. And I really worry about that. And I don't know that there's a right answer here. I don't think there is. I totally buy the health benefits when the child is at risk and the mother is at risk. But beyond that whole debate is very scary. And I worry that there are too many governments in the world that would misuse this.
Yeah.
And it would.
And also, I mean, one of the things that I talk about in the book is, you know, Apple and Google and Vice Media, the production company Vice, who I've worked for. In America, they will already pay for you as a woman to freeze your eggs so that you don't have to worry about your biological, you know, clock ticking or whatever it is, although men have biological clocks that tick as well. I can imagine a future where those same companies might say, hey, you know, we'll pay for your baby to be gestated in a bag so that you can carry on working. And then will having natural pregnancy become a sign of low status, of unplanned pregnancy? You know, will we look at pregnant people walking down the road and think, God, you made a mistake there?
The rich world will have this whole notion of gestation as a service.
Yeah.
And I think what it'll also do is reinforce kind of rich-poor divides, where the poor in a nation can't access this or lose those rights, and then the poorer nations can't afford to even offer the service other than the very rich in their societies. So it just reinforces that divide and that attitudinal divide that starts to say, oh, poor nations, they're the ones where the mother goes to full term with the baby. And aren't we clever and wonderful because, you know, we get rid of it, you know, 3 weeks after.
Yes, we don't force women to go through this potentially lethal process of squeezing a baby out of their bodies. Yeah.
I think we have to remember as well, though, like we're talking about what will the perceptions be and so on and so forth. Like there's already so much perception and pressure, I mean, on everyone, but when it comes to children, particularly on women. I mean, again, like this whole thing, you know, true female empowerment, the freedom to work 60-hour weeks for a corporate giant and sacrifice time with their family. Yeah, that is empowerment because it's choice. Yeah. About choice. If women want to work 60-hour weeks for a corporate giant and sacrifice time with their family in the same way that men do, then it's choice. And I think the second thing that I think there's a lot of questions in the comments around evidence, what kind of damaging effects might this have, connection with the gestation period. And I think this comes back to, you know, there's a severe inequity in terms of focused research on women's health as well. There's a severe lack of information on female reproductive systems, on periods, on endometriosis. We don't even talk about endometriosis. And then, of course, on pregnancy. And, you know, the focus is of understandably so always on the baby more so than the mother.
Yes,
And
yes.
so we have to remember that this conversation, yes, there's some really interesting kind of ethical questions and whatnot. If it was, you know, and when you're talking about state, I mean, God, the state controls abortion rights, and look at what's happening there. So if we talk about state getting more control, they already have a lot of control, and already a lot of places are pulling back. So I think the conversation must always kind of come back to this thing around, we as a society do not prioritize the kind of knowledge and power of women, regardless of what tech or whatever we're talking about, and that has to kind of be central in the discussion.
But this is what I mean by we live in this imperfect world, and part of the imperfect world that we live in is that we really fetishize the pregnancy and birth. And if as a woman, you know, it's totally taboo to say, I think this is a bit gross, or I'm really scared about getting torn and stitched up. If you're not prepared to joyfully go through that, then it's assumed that you're ill-equipped to be a mother full stop, which is just completely not the case at all. It is a tiny, as somebody who's gone through it, it is a tiny, tiny part of being a mother.
I remember when in the late 1970s, people were talking about test tube babies or IVF. And for a while, people were sure that children who found out they'd been conceived in a test tube would be emotionally stunted, that they would be in various ways soulless little devils. Some people actually literally thought they wouldn't have souls, but the kind of secular view was that they would be damaged. This doesn't seem to be in the case. Most families which have had test tube babies seem to be as normal as the rest of them. Do you think that in due course we'll look back at this discussion and say, gosh, these guys were bigoted and out of touch, they just couldn't imagine the future?
I think that test tube babies are a really good example of this, because, and I say this in the book, that when IVF technology came to pass, investigation into the causes of infertility, blocked tubes, all of the rest, was just pretty much abandoned. You couldn't get funding for it. Like, what's the point? There's a solution there. We'll just use it as a solution. In the same way with this, is once this technology exists, we're not going to look for ways to make pregnancy better socially and medically. We're not going to worry about it, because what's the point? We've got an alternative here. It may very well be, I mean, obviously, it's really important to say that of all the technologies I look at in the book, this is the one that's furthest away, but it is going to exist. But because it's far away, we don't know about the effects of, you know, what happens if you grow a baby outside of its mother's body. How will it suffer psychologically? I'm sure they will have things like, they will play, I mean, in some of these artificial womb models, they are playing a fake heartbeat. They are playing the mother's voice there to compensate. I'm sure there will be ramifications that we can't think about. But it may very well be that it is just like IVF, that it doesn't make that much of a difference. Although even with IVF, there are some suggestions that IVF babies are different. But I think the danger comes from, just like with IVF, that once you have an off-the-peg solution, you stop looking for answers to the original problem or investigating the original problem. And in fact, you could do a lot better by researching what the problem is and how we can solve the problem, rather than circumventing it with technology. Silence. I've stunned you all into silence there.
I think it's just it's an incredibly rich area for exploration. There are so many dimensions to it, and as we're all talking, I'm thinking of, you know, 30 or 40 other points come up around this.
Good, that's what I want for my book.
And I think it's good that we're bringing it up so early, or you're bringing it up so early, before it becomes a reality, so that you can have a really healthy and vibrant debate. And if one of the outcomes is that we end up doing a lot more research on women's health and what happens in pregnancy or what doesn't happen in pregnancy and all of those kinds of things, that would be a really positive outcome on the route, because I think inevitably it will happen. It will get licensed. David's gone for more sandwiches. You know, we could see a lot happen. Elaine Cameron is pleading with us to talk about death.
Well, David was worried that we wouldn't have time to talk about everything. I'm really glad that everybody wants to talk about everything.
Well, he's not here, so we're running the show now. So let's talk death. Sorry, David.
I can talk very quickly about death.
Go for it.
Death is this idea that there have been many attempts over the years to create a machine that will deliver the perfect death, a painless, dignified death at the time of your choosing, without a doctor's input. And it is part of this kind of libertarian, we've had enough of experts, age that we're in, that there is a movement of people who would say that they are right to die advocates, but in fact they're not, because what they don't want is a, hello, David.
We're talking about death. You came in at a good point.
Death very quickly.
I was hoping we would touch on death, because at least one person said that she came here for the death.
Okay, well, I'll talk very quickly about death. Attempts to create a death machine that will deliver a perfect death. But more than anything, this death machine removes assisted suicide. So it legally indemnifies the person providing the machine because you press the button. So you are the instigator of your own death, even though somebody else is helping you. And we think about the perfect death, I'm sure, well, I don't know. I would imagine you think a perfect death is you take some tablet, you go to sleep when you die. And actually, there is only really one substance that will give you that, and that's the substance that we give dogs when we put them down. It's what they give people on death row. It's what Marilyn Monroe overdosed on, but it's illegal. Unless you're a vet, you can't have it. So there's a big black market in people trying to get hold of this wonder drug. It's not easy to get hold of. I wouldn't suggest you try and get hold of it on the internet, because there are lots of cowboys that try and sell it to you. So there is a man there have been several men, it's always men, several men who have developed a machine, different kinds of machines with varying degrees of remoteness from you to absolve themselves of responsibility for your death. And there is a man who has invented a machine that is fully 3D printable, that uses entirely legal components. It uses liquid nitrogen. It's a giant capsule that you print, you lie inside it, you pour liquid nitrogen into the bottom, and you die of oxygen deprivation, but you don't feel breathless, you don't suffocate. So you have a hypoxic euphoric death at a time and place of your choosing. And this device is fully biodegradable and doubles up as a coffin. So the thinking is you go to the place that you want to die, you die there, maybe you have a party there, and then you can be buried in it. Which is all very well, but there are lots of issues to do with who gets access to this machine. If there is no doctor there, how do they make sure that you're of sound mind when you decide to do this, when you download the plans, that you're not bereaved or drunk when you do this online test? There is an online AI psychiatric assessment, but I don't think AI at the moment can replace psychiatry. And then ultimately it comes back to, this is the sort of central thesis of my book, which is, do we actually need this technology when what we should really be doing is changing the laws on assisted suicide and the right to die, and giving people this substance, which you can give your dog, and allowing people to do that. And I am somebody who thinks that doctors should be involved in making these decisions. And it shouldn't be a technology that you just throw out there, because there is always a possibility that people want to live, and it might be frustrating that there are gatekeepers to a peaceful, perfect death. But I think that is better than the idea of this technology being thrown out there.
Anybody speaking against changing the law on this?
Oh no, definitely not me.
In fact, it's interesting because you when you were introducing this and you were saying, talking about things in 200 years, what people will look back on. The whole genesis for all of this came to me. I was in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, and I was looking at displays of manacles that they used to chain up slaves. And the friend that I was with said, wow, can you believe that we did this like 200, 300 years ago? And what do you think people will look back on now? And for me, it is the right to die that I think we will look back on in the same way that we allow terrified people to just suffer horribly. And the whole market for this DIY death, the black market for this substance, the people who pay membership to these organizations that teach you how to kill yourself, the market is there because our laws are in such a mess, and we just need to change our laws, I would say.
I think there's a couple of perspectives that kind of I think about this through. First of all, you can kind of liken it to this similar sort of arguments around decriminalizing and therefore effectively regulating drugs, right? It can help reduce the bad stuff around drugs, and you have to look at Portugal for that. Secondly, my gran is in a hospice with very advanced Alzheimer's. It's horrific. So I'm absolutely an advocate. She wants to die. So that I'm an advocate from a personal perspective, and particularly when you're seeing it in front of you, it's kind of like, wow. And thirdly, I used to be a Samaritan, one of the people on the phone lines that talk to people when they want to speak. And Samaritans have a very in order to be a Samaritan, you have to really buy into this idea of self-determination when it comes to life and death. So when someone calls up and you answer the phone and they say that they want to die, of course, as a Samaritan, our job is to try and help people not want to die, but we're not allowed to convince people not to. And it's more about being a support and sometimes being there in the moment because the person has made that decision and they don't want to do it on their own in a criminal way. I mean, even the word commit suicide, as it used to be a crime. So I think it's kind of building on what you said there at the end, Jenny. It's about not just laws, but also support, and about, frankly, good mental health services and all around the world for people that, both in terms of if you're suffering and wanting to die for that reason, getting the support to work through that, but also when you're in that moment of going, that's me, I'm kind of ready to go. It's ensuring that you're able to talk that through and make that decision in a way that's guided and is not alone. So I'm very for movements in the space. The whole DIY thing, printing thing, I think that's kind of still reeks of black market. I think there should still be some regulation and medical oversight.
Rohit?
It throws up some really interesting scenarios, doesn't it? Because on the one hand, you absolutely want better provision of support services, mental health services, care services to help you navigate your way through making a choice and then helping your family understand that choice and then helping them cope afterwards and having all the medical procedures. But equally, we're in a world where it feels like society, i.e. government, is going to have less and less money and is going to be more and more focused on how do we cut the cost of having a citizenry. So you could see a more callous, financially focused state saying, actually, there will be a van come round, once a week where you're getting old or you've got lots of secondary conditions. You are a net cost to society over the next X years of £500,000 or £2 million. If you jump in the back of the van and choose to press the button yourself, we'll just send your family a check for 25% of that and support them through. Or, you could see that situation of saying, look, we're about to give you life in prison. Actually, you'd save us a lot of money by just jumping in the back of this van. And again, we'll send a check to your family. You could see models emerging where a more callous state starts to use this as a technology to really just control the costs of running society, which would be horrendous.
We already have that in society. The Conservatives wanted old people to die and everyone to get, this immunity that we're meant to have. I mean, I know, yeah, okay, but if we're talking about these future scenarios that sound very sci-fi-esque, it's very easy to look at current society and current government and also current corporates. We're talking about governments having, and if you're talking about, look at death panels and the decisions around where you allocate health funding, and the fact that we have the going in and asking old people in homes whether they want to sign a DNR. We do have these systems already, which are good and bad depending on how you argue it. But if we're talking about, government not having enough money, I think we have to start talking about democratic socialism or something, as opposed to saying, oh, we shouldn't have this technology because we might have the government coming around asking us to
no,
die.
I don't think you're saying that we shouldn't have this technology, but
we shouldn't. I just say that, project.
No, it's interesting that you bring up life imprisonment. The guy who invented Sarco, the sarcophagus that kills you, the device. In fact, it's a shame that I'm not in my office because then I'd show you a picture of it. It's quite an amazing thing. He has lobbied for people with life sentences to be given the right to die if they choose it. He's an extreme libertarian, and there is this thin end of the wedge argument, but there certainly is a wedge. and so the challenge is not technological. The challenge is how do you frame legislation to make sure that the right to die isn't abused. But this is a situation where technology is not going to help us. We kind of already do have a way of giving people the perfect death. We just haven't worked out how to deliver it. And the technology that this is promising is just a way of absolving people of responsibility. And in fact, we need more than ever for people to have responsibility to make sure that the scenario that you describe, Rohit, doesn't happen.
But that was something that really interesting you said earlier, Rohit, about one of the great things about a lot of these technologies happening, whether or not they come to market, as you rightly pointed out, a lot of times they don't, is the fact that they open up discussion, right? And the fact that they get us talking about euthanasia in a way that's not the old debate that we've been having for a long time, but possibly maybe shifts the conversation forward and makes us rethink laws, morals, you know, whether or not we still agree with what we have thought for years. So, you know, I couldn't agree more that I think you're right, it's not a tech thing, but perhaps tech coming out and that focus on it is what we need as a society to be able to move these conversations forward.
Yeah,
so because my Wi-Fi died, yeah, on you go quickly, Rohit.
I was having a conversation with someone this morning, and the kind of upshot was that actually the more deaths that something causes in society, the less debate we have about it. So the closure of supply chains during the pandemic, this person was saying that there's Food and Agriculture Organization research that says 160 million people will die this year from food poverty caused by the closure of supply chains during the pandemic. And there's literally been no discussion of that whatsoever. We're worrying about the 3 million plus who'll die from the pandemic, quite rightly, but it's almost just passing through society as a given that, oh yes, there'll be 160 million people die of food poverty, and we're not even having that conversation. And I do worry that some of these things will just slip in, and a bit like death panels and the postcode lottery around health access and things, it'll be another one of those things where there are kind of choices made that just slip into society with very little debate.
Well, we absolutely do need more debate. We're almost out of the 90 minutes that was allocated. Because my Wi-Fi died twice, I have lost all record of the questions and answers that were submitted, but I do want to ask the panelists to have a quick look at their own copy of the Q&A windows.
Yes.
If you see something there that you can answer within a minute or so, I think it is worth feeding back some comments. So I'll let you moderate, as you've been doing well by yourselves without much help from me. If there is something there you'd like to respond to in the next few minutes, let's do that.
I'll go first. There's so much I want to respond to. William Cosrello has a lot of thumbs up. He has one that says, porn doesn't seem to make human relationships less rich. If I could raise my eyebrow, William, it would be up here. He says, is it possible that relationships could be fortified through experiences with a robot, e.g. quest for novelty or a group sex experience? I would say, first of all, I personally do think that porn does have the potential to be quite damaging. If you look at children who grow up in a world where that's their first representation of sex is seeing that, I do think it has the potential to make human relationships less rich. It distorts a norm, a level of a norm. That's not to say that I'm anti-porn per se, but I do think it has the potential to make human relationships less rich. However, it is possible that robots, the relationships, you know, you could have experimental sex if you used a robot in a threesome. You could have, totally, absolutely no doubt. But for me, what is interesting is the idea of having a relationship with a robot, not just sex, the idea that you're having a discussion with a robot that systematically tries to learn about you and what you like and what you don't like, and wants to be your friend, and that can be your girlfriend, and the implications of that rather than just the sex. And that's the tech that's being built into these sex dolls at the moment. It's the artificial companionship that is worrying for me, really, rather than just the sex.
Yeah, I'd say that it would take all the novelty out of it. If you talk about a threesome, you know, you'd control what the robot did, so there would be no natural element to it.
It's still a twosome.
And if you wanted novelty, then go seek novelty. And if you want a group sex experience, then go find a conscious sexuality community and have one there where there are healthy rules around what you do. I don't think robots are the answer to that.
Anyone else want to take any of the other questions?
I'm just scrolling up. My thing keeps jumping back down when people...
So Grace says, will sex robots be utilised by big data companies to collect info on our desires? Yes, and more. and more grace. If you imagine, here is a being that's being touted as being your best friend who systematically wants to ask you questions to learn about you. They will collect data on what you like and what you don't like, and maybe they will give you reasons to vote for people. I mean, you think about Facebook can collect data on what you like and what you don't like, but imagine that technology and the potential for it to make recommendations to you if it's the being that you love most, that you've got nobody else to talk to, and this being says, hey, I really think you should try this shampoo, or you should really try this product, or vote for this person. The potentials for misuse of data with something as intimate as a sex robot are enormous.
Yeah.
I'm hearing the dystopians winning this discussion, that all of this technology has got lots of downsides. I do want to speak up for, I think, most of the technology, if used wisely, if discussed in advance, if considered in its broader social context, could help us to be wiser, kinder, and give us more choice. And the choice is important. In the past, people's lives were constrained by what technology would do for them, not very much, but now we have much more choice. And so I want to say that let's continue this discussion, exploring the upsides and the downsides.
I think just one brief thing I wanted to put to say as well is that, well, we all know this, it's a thing that gets repeated all the time, but technology is not inherently good or bad. It is just a thing that we use in society to achieve some goals of individuals, governments, companies, whatever that is. So I think it's not necessarily, I think the whole dystopian, utopian thing with respect to tech, well, there's that old adage, one person's utopia is another person's dystopia anyway, so we can't separate them in such a clear line. And I'm pretty sure, I don't want to speak for everyone, but I'm pretty sure none of us are on one side or the other on this panel. I think it's more how much hope you have around society and around humans and people. And I think it's easier to have conversations that feel dystopian at the moment because, frankly, the news is pretty dystopian, it's pretty negative. And so I think faith in society is something that we need to consider when we have conversations about technology and not just kind of analyze the technology itself,
I think the point is to have the conversations.
Exactly.
We tend to be dazzled by new things, and the people who are selling them to us want us to be dazzled, and they don't like, I know I interview them, they don't like being asked about the potential negative. And that's what my book is about. Let's have these discussions now before these technologies properly exist, so that we can choose what we want to take from them, because there is undeniably some good in them. There certainly is. I'll be the first to say that.
If we have time for one more minute each, perhaps we can offer Jenny some requests for what she might include in volume 2 of this.
Yes, please do. I'm looking for material.
Because when I saw that death was to be included, I naively thought, oh, she's going to be talking about cryonics, the people who will submit their bodies to be preserved. And that is the one case I might consider euthanasia myself. In the future, if my brain starts deteriorating more than my body, I might be quite willing to euthanize myself if I thought I could therefore be suspended without my brain turning to mush. So that's one area, another field of death. Anything else that we would like to see covered in a future book?
My pen is poised. Give me ideas.
I know, I was going to say it's difficult because I just wrote my own book with 9 different technologies in it, so I'm kind of like, any of those really, go deeper. I don't know, I think there's a lot more to be looked at in terms of energy technologies, and especially when we start thinking about because it feels quite distant, it doesn't feel very human. When you're talking about death and birth and whatnot, it's quite easy to be like, what does it mean to be human? But you start being like, oh, fusion versus nuclear fission versus renewables and whatnot. But I do think that there's quite a lot of really interesting narratives, and particularly when we thinking about movements, Extinction Rebellion versus Greta Thunberg versus, so I would be intrigued to kind of see someone sort of dive in, particularly because one of the things I love about Jenny's book is that it does take that sort of journalistic approach as opposed to a kind of techno whatever approach, and I'd be intrigued to see how the different individuals in that space come across.
I'd throw in 2. One is that this whole area of human enhancement, augmentation, or whatever you want to call it, but all of those developments that are coming, and whether they are a natural progression from open heart surgery and all the other things to these, or are they a step change? And that sort of takes us into this whole area of of the human mind, psychology. How do we reframe the way we frame society in a world where technology is playing more and more of a role? And do we even have common kind of value and ethical basis from which to frame the narrative anymore, when some people are being enhanced, some people are having chip implants, some people are, you know, having a kind of exocortex added to their brain? How does that all look? And particularly when you start to get AI playing roles in systems and you're not even sure who you're talking to anymore.
Yeah.
And then the final bit on that is, I feel like we're kind of entering a period of chaos, let's say, and uncertainty and mess, and a good 2 decades of that, whilst systems change, technologies change, and the human capacity to navigate mess and deal with chaos and deal with uncertainty. You know, what are we doing to actually genuinely increase human resilience, rather than just the nonsense you hear at the moment?
Yes.
You know, most of the stuff that people are saying is kind of beyond drivel. But there are some interesting things, and what are the things we could do to really enhance human capacity to be more resilient and navigate this uncertainty?
One final thing I'll say, which is maybe a bit of a more of a fun one perhaps, but something I've been thinking a lot about is, as well as enhancement in sport, and what does competition look like? You know, there was a really fascinating mini documentary about a particular Nike Vaporfly, I think was the type of shoe, and it ends up getting ruled that it was, you know, the shoe was not allowed to be used because it was too enhancing or whatever. And I don't know, I think it opens up some really interesting questions around, why do we even compete? Like, why do humans have bother competing against each other, and what does it mean to want to be the best but not be the best based on yourself, but on an enhanced version of yourself, and So I'm kind of intrigued by this, and it also brings in some of the really interesting current discussions around trans competitiveness in sport as well. So that's another area I'd love to read some cool stuff.
Tokyo, the last controlled and tested Olympics.
Yeah, well, I actually wrote that article saying, is this the last Olympics where we do this, for, you know, about 5 or 6 years ago, and it didn't come true. But, you know, I think, yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think it's more than just about identity. I think it comes to the very core of, like, playing games and competing and blah blah blah.
So Jenny, what is the future for you?
What is the future for me? Well, the future for me is that at the moment I've started this new breakfast show on Times Radio. That means I have to get up on Fridays, Saturdays and Sundays at 3:30 a.m. So I'm very tired. That's my present. I'm used to that. And then I want to write another book. Writing this book was the greatest joy of my life. I've never enjoyed anything so much. So I'm looking for ideas for my next one. I have a few ideas. It all depends on, I've been very pleased with the response to the book so far, and that people seem to really get where I'm coming from. So if there's more of that, then there will be more in a similar vein. I think there's plenty more to explore. And can I just say what an absolute pleasure it has been to talk to all of you, and also all the people in the, I've given panels like this before about my book, and I've given interviews before, but it's so amazing to talk to such highly informed people. My brain is fizzing from having spoken to all of you. So I really have really enjoyed this. Thank you.
It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
That's great to hear. London Futurist is back on Saturday, as it turns out, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when we are looking at the views of Jeffrey Funk, professor based in Singapore, who argues that startups aren't anything like as profitable as they used to be, that all the easy pickings for innovations have gone, that the way we're doing innovation is no longer working, and he'll be making recommendations for different ways in which innovations, so that we can have new Googles and new Apples in the future, rather than very pale imitations. So you'll find out about that online. It remains for me to say thank you very much to Rohit Talwar, Gemma Milne, and Jenny Kleeman, to everybody who's asked questions. And I do, my hand on my heart, fully recommend this book. It is something that made me laugh, but also made me shudder from time to time in the right way.
It's very beautiful. It's a very beautiful book too.
It is.
Well
I really loved it. I really loved the cover, Jenny. Honestly, when I got I was very privileged to get a proof very early on from Jenny, so I've been fangirling about it for a long time.
Well, it is mutual, Jenna.
Right. So I'm going to switch off the recording. Thanks to everybody.
Thanks.
Cheers all.
Bye-bye.